Hello, and welcome to A Dash of Salt. I'm Dr. Shelley Ann, and I'm so glad you're here. Whether you stumbled upon this podcast by accident or you're here because the subject drew you in, welcome. SALT is an acronym for Society and Learning Today. This podcast was created as an outlet for inviting fresh discussions on sociology and learning theories that impact your world. Each episode includes a wide range of themes that focus on society and everyday learning, whether formal or informal. So let's get stuck in, shall we? Welcome to A Dash of Salt. Today I'm joined by Ciara O'Siorain. Ciara is currently a Master's in Philosophy student at Trinity College Dublin, studying children's literature. Her research interests are in depictions of monstrosity and child abuse narratives in modern children's fiction. She's a writer with the Museum of Childhood Ireland and an intern with the Miracle Makers production team, and the executive editor of Childlike, a journal of childhood, which we will be speaking about today. Welcome, Ciara. I'm really delighted to have you on the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Shelley. It's great to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit, starting off here, about your background, about yourself, and about your program of research with Trinity?
Yeah, of course. So I'm just finishing up my master's. As was mentioned in my brief bio, I've been studying children's literature throughout the pandemic with Trinity College. I've been interested in children's literature since second year of my undergrad, so it's kind of a no-brainer for me to move forward with the master's in children's literature. And the MPhil course is incredible. If anyone listening has considered joining, it is I really encourage you to do so. It's been the best year of my life so far, despite all the craziness of COVID-19. And throughout the year, I kind of became interested in looking at how certain childhoods are excluded or kind of made abnormal almost in texts. And these kind of experiences I felt were very commonplace ones that are the messier bits of childhood, kind of the weird kids in school, the kind of, oh, that kid doesn't have the right lunch, they don't have the right uniforms, they don't have the right wear. And there's this weird dichotomy that kind of crops up all the time. So I was kind of interested in researching this throughout the year and finding what children's literature does to create this ideal of the real child.
So that's really, really interesting. So a lot of these things that pop up in social justice education and trying to teach people to be more aware of the realities of life and social justice, but you're not actually looking at the through the social justice lens specifically. You're actually looking at the reality of these stories and why are they not depicted. Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about. I'm really interested in the content of your research thesis and these depictions of monstrosity and child abuse narratives in modern children's fiction. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So I was kind of throughout my undergrad looking at modern horror fiction. I kind of picked a lot of modules that were coinciding by either children's literature or I'd pick horror. So it's just a really weird thing to kind of write a load of essays about. But as I'm reading a lot of the theories at the time, there was so much cohesion between these theories where how you depict a monster in horror is very similar to how we then try to portray a lot of moral ideas to children. And these figures that are quite frightening, that are quite unstable in identity, that don't really know who they are. So a lot of modern horror kind of leans into tropes from mental illness, kind of schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder. And a lot of these symptoms are then made monstrous to terrorize their audiences. And a lot of children's literature kind of does the same thing, especially with this modern narrative of broken home children. There's a lot of the same tropes where the bad parent or the bad minder has this divided identity. They have this unstable personality that is dangerous. And then the trope kind of starts to play with this notion of are they mad or are they bad? And then depending on how the text decides to look at this person, then we follow this thing of we need to institutionalize them or we need to get rid of them, which is terrifying. And it makes sense in a horror fiction because you're okay, Frankenstein or some zombie monster, that makes sense. We're going to have to get rid of that thing that frightens us, that is a kind of self and other. Whereas in these narratives, it just felt super problematic. So a lot of my research now is looking at how How did they come about in the first place? How can we look at them through a horror lens? And by doing that, can we stop?
Mm-hmm. And, it's really interesting because, sometimes little children could never even be exposed to any type of horror or depictions of horror, whether in stories or movies or that kind of thing. But yet, nightmares and monsters are very real to young children, where they are scared often by things like that. Where do you think that comes from? And do you think that some of these depictions that are written about and brought up in children's literature and that type of thing are based on some of the nightmares that children have?
Like, I think a lot of our use of children's literature, especially from where it came from, was a lot of folk tales. And a lot of folk tales are about morals. They are about monsters and bad things in the woods. So there's a whole lot of that does come into modern children's literature still. But my problem, I think, with it is the depictions of, for what I'm looking at for my thesis, it's all like female characters that are abnormal, that have kind of been either witchified, like they're aligned with the witch, or they're aligned with this kind of bad mother, this kind of earth mother who swallows back her young, who doesn't show warmth. She's just cold, like dry earth kind of mom. And I find it just so fascinating because I'm like, it didn't really need to be done. Like, it doesn't have to be a witch. You don't have to make like assumptions that this person is witch-like. You don't have to make her magic. You don't have to put these things into the text, yet we have. So it's fascinating to like think about, like, why, what are we doing when we put these images into these books that have such a sensitive nature to them?
Mm-hmm.
What is the purpose of that?
Yeah. And even things like the books and the movies now, like, even you're making me think of Disney, the uber popular Disney movies, that always have that element of evil, and these children in these Disney stories lose parents, sometimes
Yeah.
one, sometimes both. And there's always an element of evil or an evil person or an entity there. And while there might be a good ending and a happy ending to the story, there's a lot of darkness that happens within the story, that now children have to deal with. And I don't know if it's a society, hoping that it in some way that it's supposed to help children to deal with some of the dark things that happen in society. But I don't think that it works that way.
Yeah, like one of my like parts of my thesis is looking at the structures that surround poverty, that surround child abuse, that surround so many things that have a factor on how children become abnormal or like become perceived of abnormal. And it's just fascinating because so many of the texts that I'm looking at, even though most research coming out is like, abuse is classless, it happens across all of the like wealth divides, but they're all lower class families. And there has to be at some stage in the text this reference to how bad the home is, that it's a dilapidated shack, it's a flat, it's council home. Like it's just so fascinating to me that there's like this build up first of how to make a home homely. And then we show that it's not a homely home. So surely the kids that are coming out of it can't be children. They can't be right. There's something wrong. So the text kind of works this plot around, okay, well, we found the reason. We're going to say it's mom. We'll take that. So mom is unwell. She's got a mental illness or an addiction that has now made her monstrous. She looks monstrous in the depictions. Her hair is lank. She's super pale. She looks ghostly. She's got long fingers that are working erratically at what she's doing. And it's absolutely terrifying. Like, you're right. And most of the time, that's okay. Those are actually often realities. Sometimes that is how we perceive the situations we're in. But the ends of the text rarely ever give you a real conclusion. It's never, okay, well, we're going to be taken out of poverty. People have noticed this is really wrong. Children shouldn't be raised in this environment, and we should be supporting families to be like getting out of this. That is never what happens. It's like, we'll institutionalize someone. They'll suddenly be right as rain, and we'll just end the book there. It's crazy to me. So for me, it's like, who is the audience of these texts? Who's buying it? Because people who've been through it don't buy that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what I mean. I'm like, why are you taking then? If the audience of the text isn't the person who's actually going through this and isn't the child who's experiencing this, then you're taking the traumatic experiences of that group for a wealthier class of people, a more privileged class of children, for them to read so they can experience it and be like, oh, that's really, really bad, but it's not happening to me. So I can just believe the end of this book, close it over, and get on with my life.
Right.
It's just really fascinating of like how, like, obviously, that's very much like a biased. I'm still in my research, but for me right now, so far, I just can't find anything that's like countering me.
Yeah, you make a really good point there, though, that are these books and are these elements of literature, um, when it's supposed to be classless or a classless society, it is very classist,
Mm,
and those people who aren't in those situations are reading about it, and saying, oh well, that's not me, so I don't have to worry about it. But and that comes also from some of the folk tales and the stories as well. Only bad little children, or only children from bad backgrounds and experiences suffer this type of ailment, or experiences where you don't have to worry about that. But take heed and
yeah.
listen, because you don't want to be uh, one of those children that gets stuck into that situation. And yeah, so it does seem to be an issue of opposition, when we really should be thinking about stories that build children up.
More modern stories coming out of like the last 20 like years, there definitely has been a change. Like there's a lot more of like, we are socially accountable for these children. Do you know, like this society is accountable and it's not really on the school specifically, this one teacher that we don't like, and it's not on this mother, and it's not on the children that are also in the home. So yeah, I do think there's like a great change wave, but it's like interesting to note there's not like enough research done on the specific time of like we're modern. It's like the early 80s, but it's just wild the text coming out of it. It's absolutely fascinating.
And just for the listeners, Ciara is obviously from Ireland, and
I am.
I just wanted to give that piece of background there, because Irish uh, folk stories and children's literature and stories that were told to children in Ireland over the many years have often been very dark. And even the stories, you're probably much more familiar with them than I am, but even the stories of the fairies. And from my perspective, an American perspective, I would have never known that the story of sort of the fairies would have had such a dark undertone to it. Where when I moved here and I heard about the fact that the story of the fairies is not, it's not, they're not really told in a good space and place. So, coming from there, I can see why that would be really, fascinating, and why you would be interested in this.
A lot of our beginning kind of folktale-esque things that grew into being children's literature are so dark. Like they started off pretty dark, like across all cultures, but Ireland specifically has quite a few very dark mythological stories.
So I want to actually get to talking about your this amazing publication that you've started. What I'd like to know is, what inspired you to start this? It's the Childlike Journal, and it's online. It's an online space. It's a very inclusive journal where you have various bits of artwork, and you have some graphics, but then you also make sure that there's text available for that's very easily readable for people that you know have problems with reading the text in the graphic areas and things like that. So I'm just really curious as to what inspired that in you.
I think I was more inspired by the theories I was reading, like looking into children's literature, like historically, was so interesting. And obviously, I did a lot of it at undergrad level, but in master's level, I think like the in-depth look was just mind blowing. And like for me, it completely blew my mind in that I have no idea what it is that childhood is. I don't know what children are. I don't even know what I would call children's literature, like as a specific thing. Like I don't know. It just seems like so far branched. So I think when I was starting Childlike, what really annoyed me was this like use of like childish and childlike that are somehow to do with children, about how children as one massive homogenous group behave. But like the ideas of being childish are so rude. They're so awful. And like how people respond to being called childish versus childlike, which is meant to be like, oh, inspiring and creative, and you're full of joy and love and like naivety, but a good naivety. I just found it fascinating. Whereas like being childish was like you're gullible, you are self-obsessed, you're self-absorbed, you make selfish decisions, you don't know anything. I was like, how dare you talk about children like this? Do you know, I thought it was fascinating. I was like, I don't know a single child who can encompass all of those things to get this kind of adjective slapped on. Like imagine we ever did adultish, do you know, of all the negative things adults do. We are far more selfish. We are far worse. I just found it fascinating. So I think I like opened up the journal trying to discover this kind of sense of what is child. What do we think of children? How do we think of our own childhoods? How does that apply to our art, to our academic work? What do we look for in concepts of childhood? So I thought making like a multidiscipline kind of every form journal would kind of bring to light like intrinsic concepts about childhood or like notions about childhood. And it has become more unstable. Spoiler alert, I have even less idea of what any of it means.
So, well, okay, on the tail of that, with that whole idea that you it's more unstable and you don't have, you have less idea of what that means. How do you actually come up with the themes and the content for childlike, and then also how do you recruit your contributors?
So I'd usually come up with themes by like whatever I'm reading at the time. Like a lot of the time when I'm doing my research, like I'll be reading a theory that I think is just fascinating. So I think our last theme was about relationships between like adult and child in society. And I was reading like a lot of kind of classic children's literature theorists who kind of argue about how do adult powers influence the behavior of children, and is there such a thing as a natural child in the first place when all the time we are conditioning children? And if we're seeing something in children that we don't like, is it our fault, or is this like a reflection of how we're behaving, what we're modeling for children? So I was really fascinated by this kind of like ideas of how do we influence our own ideas of childhood, because it's a concept that benefits us really. So when I opened it up, I wanted to expand on a section I already had, which was like big kids think big thoughts, where I anonymously survey the public to see what they thought of childhood, what they thought of childlike, what they thought of selfishness and childlessness, and whether they thought like there were interconnections between these like concepts. And that was really fascinating. So I wanted to open that even wider. Usually it just took up like a double page spread, but I opened it to an entire interview series in this one, and I found it fascinating. It was brilliant. So it's really exciting. Sometimes like the themes kind of lead to even better content for me. So I'm excited for the next one. The next one is basically because of how much work I've been doing on my thesis. The only theories I've been reading are about like abnormality and a lot of Foucault. So I said I'd open it up as a theme on the abnormal across all boards. Doesn't matter what it is. If it's somewhat tied to childhood and concepts of being childlike, I want to hear it.
So the second issue of your childlike journal included those series of interviews that you were talking about, and then in addition to that, there were several short stories. Do you have a favorite from whether it was something that was said in one of the interviews or one of the short stories? Do you have a favorite, and what is it and why?
Oh, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. I think one of the interviews I found the most interesting, because again, I do them anonymously. I just put it on a huge Google survey and I say, anyone who wants to answer it, you can answer it. You can answer it full. You don't have to answer it all. But one of them I found fascinating because it was from someone who'd been in hospital a lot as a child. Like they were very sick and like had a lot of hospital visits. And it was about role models and how do you, like, I think the question was quite broad. It was just like, did you have any role models growing up? And they were like, a lot of the time it was like doctors and nurses that like were interchanging all the time that I look up to, but they were the people that I saw and thought really were changing my life because they were saving it. And I just thought it was such a like fascinating thing because most people were like, oh, my parents or not my parents, or maybe a teacher or someone important. But I thought like it's very rare you get to hear someone's firsthand feelings about being a child and being sick. So her interview was phenomenal. I thought it was just really fascinating. And looking at how a lot of growing up, it kind of affects this like notion of like protection that we feel when there's like a sick child in the family. You want to protect them and keep them safe and like make a lot of decisions for them, which like completely changes how they feel about their own agency. She answered really honestly on that, talking about how like even as an adult, people still kind of in her family look at her like, okay, but maybe we should make that decision. Maybe you don't know what's best for you, even though she's a full adult now and isn't very sick and like has gotten on a lot better in her life. I thought it was really, really interesting. So I think that probably is one of my favorite insights from the interviews. I loved the journal. Like I really did love every single piece that came in. And like for the submissions, it was like I just kept making the journal bigger because everything that came through the submission box, I was like, oh, I love this. Oh, we can't not have this. But there were two stories. One was from my friend Jerry, and then another was from a really talented writer called Rose that are in the issue 2. But both of them wrote these beautiful reflective pieces about their fathers. And they have no idea about each other. They do not know each other, but they had all these beautiful themes that kind of like echoed off each other. And I loved them. I loved both of them. And I was like, this is going to be so good. I'm so happy to have them like so close side by side in the journal. They were really beautiful. I think I cried like a good few times going through the editing reading.
Yeah. In the journal, I had a favorite, so I thought that's why it'd be fair enough for me to ask you what your favorite was. But one of the short stories was by Ross Coleman, and it was the fundamental differences between adults and children. And it really captured my attention and my imagination. Because this story, it was a very short story. I think it was only maybe 2.5 pages. But it was just a moment in time from a very, very young child's perspective. And it was that interaction between, interestingly as well, between a daddy and the child. And so you don't know if the child is a male or a female, but you know that daddy is the one that's nurturing and caring for him in this short little brief moment in time. And this child is having that interaction and that experience with his daddy, who's rocking him, who's feeding him, who's reading him beginning to read him a book that's been read to him many times. But then there's also those things that are going on outside of his little world with his daddy, where there's a knock at the door. Or a telephone call, I can't remember now, knock at the door or a telephone call. And, daddy is interrupted by something that the child is not really aware of, but knows that is hearing that something, not so pleasant is happening, but daddy's still making things very pleasant for him. And it's almost like the only thing that was frustrating, but was beautiful at the same time, was that there was no real conclusion or no ending to this little short story. But it really reminded me that many of the memories and the stories that I think of, like even in my own childhood, those moments are without conclusion. You can't, you might be able to remember those moments in time, but can you really think, how did that actually conclude? What was the inclusion? And so I guess my question was, do you think that as the editor, do you think the author that was intentional? And what do you think about that story?
I love this story. I'm so biased. Ross is one of my like very, very close friends, one of my best friends since the very start of undergrad. And we kind of got close from sharing writing with each other. We'd give like feedback, we would read through each other's work, we would change things up for each other, try see what we could like do to get them published wherever. And I've just always had like insane respect for Ross's writing because it's incredible. It is so deft. It has like such incredible subtlety throughout anything he's done that I've gotten to read. It's just been incredible. Like he's a poet as well, and his poetry just has like 3 lines that will blow you away. So I was very biased when Ross decided to write in. I was like, woo! So excited, waiting on tender hooks to see what it was going to be. And I can definitely say that like the ending, that like uncertainty is absolutely classic Ross Coleman. And it's amazing. Like it's this perfect, like you say, it's just this snapshot. It gives you everything you need to know about this single tender moment, this agony. And then the last lines are kind of just really a phenomenal summation of being like a really good I'm their parent, where it's like the sacrifice is real. I've just went through something, but I'm not going to take my stuff into my children. Like I'm going to be there for my kids. And it's just brilliant.
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
the standard was really high. Issue 2, like everything that came into the submission box, I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, it is really great. It's so thought-provoking. And with that being said, what do you hope that the readers of Childlike will take away from reading these stories that you present to them in the various issues?
Well, I think definitely for issue 2, like I kind of prompted people to just consider their relationships again. I think like it's very difficult to know what you're bringing to the table for the next generations of people to come without reflecting on your own. Like, who influenced you? How did you become how you are today? What are the biggest values that you hold dear to you that you'd want to share with other people, and why? Why do you hold them? How did they come about? So a lot of like the journal was kind of with that in mind. It was kind of like reflective pieces. It was kind of these real tiny snapshots from childhood that were like so monumental and important for a lot of like the contributors. And that was what I really wanted. I really wanted to push that kind of like idea of like, you need to kind of reflect. And it's good, you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of beautiful things that come from it, like art, like this kind of these storytellings, these captured moments that are really, really important.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it was really, really important for me to kind of push that. I think I had it in my editorial as well, where I was I hate writing the editorial beats. Like I really don't like the letters. I get like way too stressed out doing them. So I was like trying to find some connection routes of what I'm doing. And I'm like, it's actually about the art. Like I just want to talk about everyone else's art. The only reason this is like so important to me and put together is like because I so desperately want to see other people's art about this stuff, and I want to see what people are writing about. And I feel like the journal is like a really good way to like get it all together, to see like that creative notion of childhood, that creative notion of like how do relationships change us. And then you can also read about them in like the psychology essays we had. We had like quite a few children's literature essays. And it's just fascinating. I'm just always so interested to see what people come up with.
Yeah. Your letter, as the editor, is important because obviously you have a heart for this, right? And if you read something, and as we were talking about some of these stories and these favorites, and you read something that moves you, you want to promote it, and so because you want
Absolutely.
others to read it and see, maybe it will move them differently, but I think that what's the important piece is the movement in itself. In whatever way it moves somebody, there's that hope that it does move them, that it does impact them in some way. And so, I feel like your letter as the editor is important, because you're presenting this for a reason, because it has moved you, it has made an impact on you, and you are promoting these authors and these stories.
I think that's a great word, movement. Like that's really what it is about. I feel like often when I'm reading a lot of like other kind of journals, like a lot of literary journals, like there's very much like a static form to it where it's like, this is what we're saying. This is what this author means. I don't know what anyone means most of the time when they send in submissions. And I don't really want to, I'm like, I really like, if they want to tell me about what like the background of this work is when we're editing and working on it, that's great. But I love that these texts are kind of they're so relatable and also so vague.
Yeah.
Like they really could be anybody's stories at any time from anyone's childhood. And I find it just fascinating.
Yeah. And that's the philosophy behind that, is that idea of, let's just be thought provoking and encourage the brain and your mindfulness in what's within you to just to provoke thought, to move you in some way. And I think it's brilliant. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Lovely little journal. So, Ciara, what do you have planned? You gave us a little teaser about it earlier on, but I want you to expand on it some more and tell me, what do you have planned for issue 3?
I'm very excited about issue 3. So I'm obviously looking for a lot more of our like opinion pieces. We usually get in like quite a few like creative works, like writing or maybe like reflective short stories and poetry. I always love seeing people's poetry. I've one friend who's been working on a art piece for quite some time now that I'm really excited about. It's like an inversion of a poem that I'm not going to reveal because I think it gets rid of like the whole theme, but she's basically flipped the children and the adults from the poem and drawn them out. And it is so cool. And I'm so excited to publish it. So that's going to be quite a good piece that's somewhere in the middle. But I'm looking to see if we could do more of the interviews because I think even more like vague questions on abnormality and normality in childhood, like where do you internalize notions of what is normal? And what is normal for your family might be so different from my family. But are we still in that nice bracket of normal?
And also, who is the decision maker as to what in childhood or in a child's life is abnormal and isn't?
Absolutely.
Who makes that decision, and why do
And
they
why
get
should
to make
children
it?
care?
Yeah,
Why should
that
they
too.
care?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would like to get a lot more child respondents. We like haven't really had any. And like it was one of the problems I felt with the last interviews was that like a lot of the people writing that I like saw the demographics of, but not like the names or whoever they were. Like it was all quite far removed from what you would call as a state of childhood. Like I think our youngest was maybe in their like late 20s. So I'd like to get the kind of more modern childhood takes on what's going on for them now. So if I find a way to do that, I would be absolutely pleased.
Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming you're not, that issue 3 isn't ready to go yet, and that you're still looking for contributors, or if issue 3 is closed, how would a potential contributor contact you? And so what's the process of getting an issue ready with potential contributors?
Yeah, so usually we kind of put out a call out on our social media that'll just be like issue 3, submission box open, rolling submissions. And because of last year, I had so many deadlines with masters that I was kind of like, this is the deadline. This is when it ends. Get it in before then. But this year, I'm much freer. I get to kind of decide my own decisions. So I'm going to just have it as a rolling submissions. December is when we must publish something. But yeah, if anyone's looking to submit anything, the theme is on the abnormal and can be interpreted however you wish. Like I love seeing psychology, I love seeing English and history essays, personal reflections, opinion pieces, drawings, poetry, creative writing, you name it, I want to see it. So submissions can be made by email to childlikejournal@gmail.com. And if you have any questions as well, you can always chat to us on Facebook or Instagram as well at Childlike Journal.
Ciara, do you have any further recommendations for somebody who might be listening? Any book recommendations or things that you might like to inform our listeners about that might be interested in finding out more?
Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone listening is interested in kind of the study of childhood and historical documentation of childhood in Ireland, there's an incredible project called the Museum of Childhood Ireland that I really, really do recommend you go and look up. So they're kind of working towards documenting or recording lived childhood and childhood experiences. So looking at how the education system in Ireland has been. I even wrote a piece about the work of Tony Flynn, who's this amazing researcher. I just think he's phenomenal, who looks at marginalia in the Pollard collection. So finding the writing of real children in the like descriptions and in the like margins of texts and trying to find out more about their lives or where they got the book from or like if they won it in a fair, or if they won it in a school contest. And it's just absolutely fascinating. So there's a piece on the website at the moment that's all about his work. And I really do recommend you read it. It was phenomenal. I was so excited to interview him. Yeah, and then some book recommendations. I think from the master's program this year, there've been some incredible books I've read. So one that I wouldn't have really come across myself because I'm not mad about teen literature. The kind of like romance stuff isn't really for me. But this book blew my mind. It's called Full Disclosure by Cameron Garrett, and it's absolutely incredible. And then more on my side of things with picture books, anything Oliver Jeffers does, I just love. But specifically, This Moose Belongs to Me just like has a special part in my heart. Like I have laughed just so much over that book throughout the year. Jeannie Baker's Belonging is incredible for eco-pedagogy. I just absolutely adore that book. Every time I look at it, there's something new I find. So that's kind of like a wordless picture book. And it's just beautiful. It like documents how people coming together can change their environments for the good. And it's just beautiful. Another text I love is Funhouse by Alison Bechdel. I know it kind of like is on that verge of like a teen adult text, but it's like a graphic novel. It's a full comic and it's just amazing. It's so good. It's like the one I've recommended to everyone I know this year, regardless of whether they're into children's literature or not. I'm like, this is so good. This is just such a good book. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think what else I absolutely loved this year. One thing that wasn't in the course, but I just loved it. I saw it in a bookshop and just picked it up and I've marveled at it every day for how beautiful it is The Wanderer. And it's by Peter van den Eyden, or Van den Enden, I think is probably how he says his name. But it's just phenomenal. It's just so complex and stunning. And it's this like monochrome graphic text that's just, oh, amazing. It kind of reminds me of like Sean Tan's The Arrival, but far more like widespread pages. It's just beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
Have you heard of the book Goodnight Opus by Berkeley Breathed?
No.
That was a book. I need to get my hands on it again. One of my older grandson has it now, but I want to get my own copy again. It was one that I used to read to my boys when they were really little. And Berkeley Breathed did Opus. I don't know if you ever remember the Opus cartoons. And again, I'm talking from an American perspective, so he met, his little newspaper cartoon may have never made it over. But if you Googled Opus, he's out kind of like this. I don't know what Opus is, like a sort of like a duck thing, maybe like a platypus kind of. I don't know what kind of character he is, but anyway, it's been a long running cartoon in newspapers back in the U.S. The Opus cartoons, and Berkeley wrote this book called Goodnight Opus, and I could actually, without even having the book in front of me now, I've read it so many times to my boys that I can still remember exactly how the story goes from page 1 all the way to the end. But it is the most wonderful little children's book that is devoid of monsters. It's more about fantasy and going on adventures when you go to bed at night, and some of the adventures that children think about when they go to bed. And Opus goes and he goes up to the moon and the Milky Way, and there's the cows in the Milky Way, and it's a really great children's book.
Cute.
So I just thought, you telling me all about these amazing books that I'm going to look into from your perspective, I thought, I wonder if you know about sort of this one, but definitely
Absolutely.
look it up
written
because
down now.
it is a fabulous and it has such a, and I know you have a little nephew. It would be a fabulous book for you to get your hands on and read to him, because it's slightly, it has slightly poetic in prose to the story, so it is easy to memorize it and to really enjoy it that way. So anyway, there's my recommendation to you and to anybody else listening. So Ciara, as we come to an end here, I always like to ask my amazing guests if you have any final words of wisdom or advice, maybe for anybody who again might be interested in publishing your journal, or just maybe getting into writing in general. Do you have any words of wisdom?
Wow, that's tricky. I think for the journal, if you want to get published and you want to send it in to us, I absolutely just recommend even emailing me to tell me a rough abstract of what you're going to do. Like, even if you don't think you're going to get it in until the day before we publish, just once I know there's work on the way, I can keep a lookout for you. So I think that's like always my big thing. It's like, I'm always like, just tell me it's coming. Like, once I know it's on the way, then I don't have to like worry about it. Whereas like, if someone's like worried that, oh, I won't have it in time, like we can work together like all the time. Like, I love working with people to get their pieces to publishability or getting to like a publishable quality. So that's my one thing for if you want to get into the journal, absolutely do. Just email me, talk to me. If you need more clarity on what the topic is, hit me up and let me know. But for writing and stuff, it's very hard. I think this year I've had the most amount of like imposter syndrome ever, just because I've had so many like really phenomenal opportunities given to me that it's kind of just threw me away, where I'm like, wait, I don't know any of these things. What? Even when it's my work, like I know it's my work I'm presenting on, I'm like, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do about this. So one piece of advice I was given this year, which I thought was just like brilliant, is that if you're experiencing imposter syndrome, it's like often the effect of having been put in a bigger pond, and that the pond that you were in before is far too small for you. You've outgrown it. You're now in this big pond, and that's absolutely scary. And yes, there are bigger fish around you, and you might not feel like you fit in, but you don't literally fit anymore in the old pond. Like, this is where you belong. And if you keep swimming, you keep growing, you keep learning, that'll be where you live. You'll be happy there. There might even be more ponds to grow into. Which I think is really like comforting when you do feel that like sudden, oh God, like I don't know how I'm going to get through this. Like, how did they pick me? I don't know anything. Like, I think knowing that like you were picked by professional people to do the job, like they have far more experience than you, and they wouldn't have picked you if they didn't think you were able for it. So yeah, I think that's like a great comfort for people who suffer like the imposter syndrome that I do.
And that's a lovely metaphor, really, to think about, is that, that if you've outgrown something, you don't often realize that you've outgrown it until you're
Absolutely.
looking at yourself thinking, oh, wait, this doesn't fit right anymore. The fit isn't right. And, it's time to move into something bigger. So what a really lovely metaphor for growth, rather than thinking about, in that dialogue of imposter syndrome, actually thinking about the fact that, you're growing.
Absolutely.
While it's painful sometimes, the growth is there. So great. See, great words of wisdom and advice. Appreciate that. Thank you so much, Ciara, for spending this time on A Dash of Salt and talking about your fabulous Childlike Journal and your journey through writing and education, and sharing again with us some fabulous nuggets of wisdom as well. I really appreciate you spending that time with me. And I will make sure to put all of your contact information and how somebody can get in touch with you into the descriptor for the podcast. We'll make sure that it's there for you guys to reach out to Ciara, and to don't be afraid to do that. And I'm assuming, Ciara, also that it doesn't matter if they don't have to be Irish. It doesn't have to be Irish. It can be international, right?
Anyone. Absolutely,
so
anyone.
It's time to internationalize.
We want to hear from everybody.
Yeah, if you're listening from Germany or from the UK or from Canada or the US, and you're interested in what Ciara has to share in the Childlike Journal and maybe your own contribution, please don't hesitate to contact her and to reach out. So Ciara, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've had such a blast.
It's been great. Thank you. I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion on A Dash of Salt, a space where you'll always find fresh and current discussions on society and learning today, seasoned with just the right touch of experts in education and a dash of sociological imagination. Please be sure to like and share this episode, and don't forget to subscribe to A Dash of Salt on Podbean so that you don't miss the next episode. Thanks so much, and we'll chat again soon.